Okay, it looks like we have people joining here, and we'll start with introductions and a little bit of welcoming here in just a second. Looks like watching our participant list grow here, which is excellent to see. All right. So first off, good just afternoon by 3 minutes here to everybody. On behalf of the, well, first off, I'm Will Shannon. I'm a board member of the Illinois State Historical Society, and I'm also the curator of the St. Clair County Historical Society in Belleville, Illinois. On behalf of the Illinois State Historical Society, I'd like to welcome you to this panel of the ISHS Symposium. Our symposium's theme is Changing Historical Landscapes, and this panel focuses on the Springfield Equal Justice Project, which, as you'll learn, stands as a sterling example of this year's theme. I'll soon introduce our panelists and then step aside so you can learn more about this innovative community project. But before I do that, I'd like to encourage you to connect with the Illinois State Historical Society. Since our founding in 1899, we've fostered scholarship on and engagement with all aspects of the history of Illinois. Connect with us online at historyillinois.org, follow us on Facebook, or check out our YouTube channel. Now, as promised, I am honored to introduce our panelists. Nancy Sage's work experience spans the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. She has served as executive director of the Jewish Federation of Springfield and its Jewish Community Relations Council since December of 2016. She's proud to be a part of the Federation's 80-year legacy that includes fighting anti-Semitism and racism, building relationships, and working together with other groups and faith traditions in the community to create understanding and to promote the common good. On behalf of the Federation, she convened the Rosenwald Initiative in 2017, a collective of organizations in the local Jewish and Black communities and interested individuals from the greater Springfield community, honoring and bringing attention to the philanthropic and social justice work of Springfield-born Julius Rosenwald. Shannon Dewith-McCormick is a strategic consultant and licensed attorney with more than 20 years experience in dialogic communication to front-end conflicts, break down silos, and resolve issues of equity and justice. Through her personal and professional life, she has assisted individuals, groups, and communities in reclaiming their agency and asserting their voice to achieve meaningful change. She's assisted cultural and professional organizations, higher education institutions, and government agencies in understanding, embracing, and integrating the diverse voices of all stakeholders to create impactful collective action. Shannon has always believed in the power of intentional communication to heal and transform the way one sees self, others, and us. Since returning to her hometown of Springfield, Illinois in 2007, she's been working to educate community and civic leaders and elected officials on transformational dialogues, a tool she developed for community engagement and conflict resolution, and holistic redevelopment, a strategy she developed for the city of Chicago. Shannon is a proud alum of Southeast High School, Spelman College, and Loyola University Chicago School of Law. She and her husband of 20 plus years, Stephen, enjoy the outdoors, live music, LPs, walking, reading, and traveling. All of that sounds like a lot of fun. Lastly, but of course not leastly, Cinnamon Catlin-Legutko, working in museums for more than 20 years. She served as a museum leader since 2001. Prior to joining the Illinois State Museum as director in 2019, Cinnamon was the director of the General Lew Wallace Study and Museum, where she led the organization to the National Medal for Museum Service in 2008. She then served as president and CEO of the Abbey Museum, where she co-led their decolonization initiative and developed practices and protocols to ensure collaboration and cooperation with the Wabanaki people. Cinnamon served as treasurer for the American Association for State and Local History from 2012 to 2014, and was the founding chair of their Small Museums Committee. She currently serves as a board member of the American Alliance of Museums. She is the author of Museum Administration, The Art of Healing, the Wishart Art Collection, then co-editor of the Small Museums Toolkit. In 2016, she gave her first TEDx talk, We Must Decolonize Our Museums. And coming up in 2021 is the release of The Inclusive Museum Leader, a compilation of essays she edited with Chris Taylor and published through the American Alliance of Museums. So now, without further ado, I will step aside, and panelists, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. One brief pause while I share my screen so that we have the PowerPoint. All right, assuming that is showing accurately. I am Cinnamon Catlin-Legutko, as just introduced, and I will be starting our session today. My job is to provide context for the Equal Justice Initiative and how it relates to the history of Springfield. Following my talk, my portion of the talk will be Nancy, who will provide background on the Springfield Equal Justice Project, how we've arrived at this moment, the nature of this coalition, and then Shannon will talk more about the Equal Justice Project's agenda and how we move forward and how we get involved. And before I begin, I always want to acknowledge the land that I'm on. We're on the ancestral lands here in Springfield of the Kickapoo and Peoria Nations. And I always want to acknowledge the more than 100,000 Indigenous people who still reside in Illinois today, despite forced removal. And I also need to acknowledge the events of this week are one of many events that have caused pain and harm to Black, Indigenous people of color. With this week's verdict, I know that a great deal of pain has been surfaced, but I also know that a path has been struck for us to move forward on. And today's conversation offers a way to step onto that path for our community here in Springfield. And for those of you joining across the state of Illinois, maybe we'll point you in directions for getting busy around social justice. So to begin, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the work of the Springfield Equal Justice Project is centered. We are working within the framework provided by the Equal Justice Initiative and their Community Remembrance Project. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is more commonly known by the painful moniker, the Lynching Museum, which opened in 2018 in Montgomery, Alabama. I'm hoping to see a show of hands, but I'm also realizing we're in webinar mode, so I won't be able to hear from you what your interests are, but I definitely want you to put questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to respond as we move forward. But hopefully many of you have heard about this significant museum that opened a few years back. But its history goes much deeper. EJI was founded in 1989 by Brian Stevenson, a widely acclaimed public interest lawyer and best-selling author of Just Mercy. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. It's important to know, though, that the Equal Justice Initiative is a private nonprofit that is committed to providing legal representation to those who've been illegally convicted, unfairly sentenced, or abused in state jails and prisons. They challenge the death penalty and excessive punishment and provide reentry assistance to formerly incarcerated people. They also challenge poverty and racial injustice and advocate for equal treatment for the criminal justice system and creates hope for marginalized communities. In 2008, they launched a new initiative, a public education project focused on telling the truth about America's racial history. EJI collaborates with communities to memorialize documented victims of racial violence and foster meaningful dialogue about race and justice. And through that process, unearth more moments of racial violence that have not been documented. That is a primary goal. Through their community soil collection project, they gather soil at lynching sites for display and haunting exhibits bearing victims' names. The Historical Marker Project erects narrative markers in public locations describing the devastating violence today widely unknown and that once took place in locations all across the South and non-South. These projects and other engagement efforts that community coalitions develop center the African American experience of racial injustice, empower African American community members who have directly borne this trauma, and invite the entire community to use truth to give voice. In 2018, as I mentioned, EJI opened the Legacy Museum, From Enslavement to Mass Incarceration, and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. You're seeing some images from that site on the screen now. This is part of their national effort to create new spaces, markers, and memorials that address the legacy of slavery, lynching, and racial segregation, which shapes many issues today. There is a through line from that deep history to today, and they are most interested in marking those spaces across the US and bringing communities forward in the conversation about how to recognize and acknowledge the harms of the past and make better for the future. Remembrance and memorialization is needed across the American landscape and even in Springfield. Springfield has this history. EJA wants us to acknowledge and learn it, consider the legacies, and work toward consideration and reconciliation. You'll hear, like I said, a little bit more about our local efforts in a minute, but let me talk more directly about Springfield's part in lynching history. And before I switch to the next slide, I just want to acknowledge that sharing information about lynchings is always painful for people of color. And I want to let you know that there are no images of lynchings that you will see in this presentation. But if at any moment you are uncomfortable, please feel free to step away and let us know what we can do to improve our conversation. So for the context, numbers and terms help us situate the history that we need to know. EJI has documented 4,084 lynchings in the South between 1877 and 1950. And as I alluded, this research continues. These numbers reflect what's been documented, but it's well known that there are many more victims of racial terror that have not been documented. In the non-South, there were 341 documented lynchings, concentrated in 8 states. Illinois is number 3 on that list with the most lynchings at 56, the 3rd highest in the non-South. And 2 of those happened in Springfield. We had originally planned to do a bit of a poll right now, but we don't quite have that set up for a variety of reasons. And so what I'd like for you to do, because we can look at the chat later, is ask you, the 1908 race riot in Springfield has been described in many ways. What words would you use to describe that event in 1908? Take some time while I'm talking to put that in the chat. What words would you use? And a valid answer is also, I have not heard about the 1908 event. Let us know, because we want to hear about who we're talking to. So it's important to understand these numbers, but it's also important to understand the terms we use to describe racial terror, the terms we use to describe genocide. And so I've selected a few here just to situate this conversation. One that may or may not be familiar to you is pogrom, which is a term that traces to the 19th century and refers to organized terror and or murder of a large ethnic group by the hands of sanctioned dominant group. Primarily, you see these atrocities that were perpetrated on Jewish communities in Europe, but many genocide scholars and historians argue that it extends to non-Jewish terror and is not always linked to anti-Semitism. In fact, some of the harms caused to people of color in the US have been described as pogroms. But it's certainly best described as the oppression and murder of a large group by a dominant societal group. The Holocaust is an example of a pogrom, and it certainly extends to numerous other events in Europe prior and post World War II. Another term that you also see in this really painful history are race or ethnic massacres. Also a European word in origination, dating to the 11th century, refers to the indiscriminate murder to a large group of people and is often targeted at a racial or ethnic minority. As the events in the US, for example, the Tulsa Race Massacre, are examined more closely, we come to understand that the words we used in the past do not accurately describe the terror and the harm that was caused. In fact, the Tulsa Race Massacre, oh look, we now have our poll, so go ahead and use that. The Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921 was originally considered or called a riot, but it was truly a massacre in that dozens of Black people were massacred at the hands of white people. In the end, it's an estimate between 75 and 300 people were murdered over 2 days. Through a process, a community healing process, they have renamed it to call it accurately a massacre. A term we see more often is race riot, which really confuses the learner at times. But in essence, a race riot is about white mob action, and that's what I want to describe more fully. A white mob action occurs when a person commits the offense when he or she, acting together with one or more persons and without authority of law, disturbs the public peace by the use of force or violence. And sometimes this is to exercise correctional powers or regulative powers over any person by violence. Lynching is something that unfortunately happens during these white mob actions. And as EJI describes it, it's more specifically a racial terror lynching, which are different from hangings and mob violence that followed a criminal trial process or against non-minorities. A horrific form of punishment carried without impunity, often in the daylight, often on the courthouse square, outside of local government, and the perpetrators are never held accountable. And then finally, the last term I want to share is civil unrest, arising from a mass act of civil disobedience, such as a demonstration, riot, or strike, in which the participants become hostile toward authority, and authorities incur difficulties in maintaining public safety and order. So in this instance of the civil unrest, people are rising up against authority, and it's not necessarily going to be a racial or ethnic situation. The events in 1908 in Springfield are most often referred to as a race riot, but it's technically something else. It's white mob violence that manifests in conflagrations, lynchings, complete destruction, or attempted destruction of properties, displacement, and extreme horror in Springfield in 1908. So let's talk a little bit about it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this story. Of course, there's much to be read. I don't want to minimize the deep history around the events of August 1908, but I do want to make sure everybody has that context as we talk about the work we plan to do here in Springfield. Some of the images here are from that event in 1908. There's a lot to be said about what was happening in Springfield at that time. But by 1908, the population of people living in Springfield, there's a significant number who identify as Black, about 3,000 people, more than any other city in Illinois at that time. And there's growing prosperity of Black people spurred on by opportunities right and left around mining and other types of industry. But it spurs a racialized response from white people after a summer of growing tensions in 1908. On the evening of August 14th, 1908, a war broke out in the Illinois capital. Angry over reports that a Black man had sexually assaulted a white woman, a white mob wanted to take a recently arrested suspect, George Richardson, from the city jail and kill him. They wanted to take matters in their own hands. And they also wanted to take Joe James, an out-of-town Black man who was accused of killing a white railroad engineer a month early. All of these accusations were false, but the angry mob, white mob, was ready to take action. Late that afternoon, on August 14th, the crowd gathered in front of the jail. The police had secretly taken the prisoners out the back door into a waiting automobile and out of town to safety. They knew what was coming. When the crowd discovered that the prisoners were gone, they rioted. First, they attacked and destroyed a restaurant owned by a wealthy white man, Harry Loper, and you see that image up on the right of your screen. And Harry was the gentleman who agreed to drive the individuals from the jail to the train to get them out of town. Once that was found out, his place was looted about 8 p.m. on August 14th. The crowd completed its work by setting fire to the automobile, which was parked in front of the restaurant, and then they headed to the levee, Washington Street between 7th and 9th, which was a business district lined with African-American and Jewish-owned businesses. Most stores were looted while shots were exchanged, and the mob persisted there for 2 hours. In the early hours of the violence, as many as 5,000 white Springfield residents were present, mostly as spectators, but still angry. The rioters, or the agitators, minus most of the spectators, continued to destroy the business district into late into the night, until they moved to the Badlands, which was a neighborhood that was predominantly Black, and found there a Black man named Mr. Scott Burton, who had stayed to protect his home. Most African-American people had fled the city, but he stayed to protect his home. He was a well-off, not well-off, I should say, a really successful barber, 56 years old. As he realized he needed to go, he ran through the backyard and was attacked by the white mob, pummeled, dragged, hanged from a tree, and mutilated until 2:30 a.m. when the militia arrived. And I'm sad to say we don't have an image of Mr. Burton, but we do have an image of the tree where he was lynched. The next day, August 15th, began quietly, but at nightfall, rioters were grouped downtown. The new mob marched west to the state arsenal, hoping to get several hundred people who had taken refuge there. But they were driven off by state troops who charged the crowd with bayonets. They then marched to a predominantly white middle-class neighborhood, in fact, right where the Illinois State Museum is now in Springfield, and seized and hung an elderly, wealthy Black resident, Mr. William Donegan, who was 80 years old, retired shoemaker, who had made shoes for President Lincoln. He was escorted to the front yard, beaten with bricks, his throat cut with a razor, and as they were attempting to hang him, the militia arrived and took him to St. John's, where he died, St. John's Hospital, where he died the next day. These two lynchings are what bring us to this moment today and the work of the Springfield Equal Justice Project. In the end, the riots toll for a city this size was really high. 2 Black men were murdered. Other white people were murdered or harmed in the process. But in the end, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of property were destroyed and more than 40 Black families displaced when their homes were burned and dozens were injured. What's significant about this too is that here we are in the land of Lincoln, and people wrote about this a lot. How could this happen in Lincoln's hometown, if you will? The grand jury, sensing this outrage that swept the nation, convened the last weeks of August and returned a total of 107 indictments against some 80 persons, ranging from riot to murder charges, but the state only managed one conviction against a man accused of having stolen a Black militiaman's saber. And of course, not long after, the woman who had accused the Black man of assaulting her shared that she had not been attacked, and he was released. A more lasting result, which is well known by many, is that this led to the foundation to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. And it led to incredible work, of course, the NAACP did, but later riots and harms in St. Louis and Chicago weren't prevented by the formation of the NAACP, but more serious riots were moderated because of the way in which people began to work together from this event. So after you hear this, did your definition change? How would you describe the events of 1908 now? What is your definition? You can let us know in the chat, or you can participate in the poll. And thank you for Shannon, I think, who's miraculously doing these polls in the background. I'm grateful for you to do that. I just have one more slide that I want to share that sets up Nancy to tell you where we're going. There are so many great projects happening in the U.S. in response to EJI's formation and the Community Remembrance Project. And I'm going to drop some things in the chat here so you can read more in a minute as soon as I'm done. I'm just going to highlight one project that's happening in the city of Alexandria, Virginia, but this slide shows you images from a variety of events happening all over the U.S. The city of Alexandria is serious about their commitment to the Community Remembrance Project. With their mission and vision firmly articulated about 2 years ago now, I want to say. They began their work with a very serious timeline that not only involves erecting memorials and collecting the soil and being part of the work, but more importantly talks about public outreach, community healing, and how we can carve together in Alexandria a better future. The project is co-chaired by 2 people who work in museums, a woman of color and a white woman, leading on behalf of the city of Alexandria. They created 7 different committees, which is amazing how many people are jumping in to help. public outreach, looking at how they can engage these conversations in the arts community, civics associations, engaging public officials and in town meetings. Then they have a committee focused on education and programming. What do each of us need to learn? How can we learn together? How do we engage with other communities of learning? And how do we sponsor other workshops wanting to do the same to understand the history of lynching and what it means in their community? They have a committee about marketing so that they can communicate thoroughly about this work. And then they have a committee dedicated to how do we do this work so that we can erect the marker that we need to erect and to collect the soil through the process that EJI has prescribed. They do that through public ceremony. They do that through further documentation of the lynchings that have taken place in their community, and the list goes on. They make real this deep history and share the truth. And the research continues with even a dedicated committee, as well as a committee focused on fundraising for this efforts, for people to travel to Montgomery, Alabama to see the location, as well as to produce events in their community. Incredibly successful example. You can see a section of their website in this slide, and I'll make sure I drop the link in there. I encourage you to spend time reading about EJI on their website, looking at the Community Remembrance Project. I'll put the link in the chat in a minute, and reading about what communities are doing. We're interested in building from those examples, and with that, I'm going to hand this over to Nancy, and I'll run the slides as she goes along. Nancy.
Thank you. Cinnamon, I think you can see me, or you should be able to see me on screen. There. I also want to start by thanking IHSH for asking me to be with you today as part of this panel, because by no means am I a historian, nor am I a scholar. So it's rather daunting to be part of this program. As you've heard, I serve as convener of the SEJP, Springfield Equal Justice Project, and I'm honored to do so. In that capacity, I have been asked to give you a bit of background as to how we got to where we are today. But first, I want to ask the audience, ask anyone watching if you could put into the chat or in the poll, if there is a poll, whether you're involved or have heard about anything similar in your own communities. So it all started, at least for us, in summer of 2019, which seems so long ago. I'm tempted to, it's so long ago that I'm tempted to start with Once Upon a Time. At that point in time, several Jewish organizations from all over the country, national, local, had traveled to the Equal Justice Institute, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, started as part of tours designed to honor the history of Jews and Blacks standing together in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, and at a time when both the Jewish community and the Black community were confronted by the rise in, and at this time now, the Jewish community and Black communities were confronted by the rise in hate crimes. About mid-fall, I received a call from our local rabbi, Datz, who's rabbi of Springfield's Temple of Bris Shalom, who gave me the heads up that a Chicago congregation was going to contact me regarding, and I'm going to say this in which the context with which we spoke at that time, assisting Springfield in bringing the lynching monument here. They had inquired about Chicago and discovered that an organization had already begun the process for Chicago. The rabbi brought it to us at the Federation as we convened the Rosenwald Initiative, a collective dedicated to honoring the legacy of Julius Rosenwald for his dedication to social justice through his philanthropy, building 5,000 schools with Blacks in the Jim Crow South. Many emails, conversations, and conference calls later, I learned that this congregation had visited the Legacy Museum and believed so much in the project that they wanted to be part of whatever we did, however we wanted them to be. And so it all began. The search for the status of this endeavor in Springfield. I had a pretty good idea of where to start with Jim Lewis, former U.S. attorney and always a civil rights activist, who I knew would know about any effort along these lines. And of course he did. And that was the first time I'd heard the name, known most to you, of Devin Hunter, and to whom we thank for this invitation to present to you today. It turned out that there had been an organization meeting, thanks to Devin, and hosted by the Dominican Sisters in late summer 2019. Jim and Catherine Harris, retired division manager at Abraham Lincoln's Presidential Library and Museum, and so much more in our Springfield community, attended. And about mid-November, Catherine, Jim, and I talked about bringing interested parties back together again. With the holidays intervening, we looked at January 2020 as the best time to call the meeting, which would be held at the Abraham Lincoln Historic Park Conference Room. Tim Good, Superintendent, Lincoln Home and National Historic Site, and part of the Rosenwald Initiative, hosted that meeting with members from the 1908 Race Riot Commission, NAACP, Frontiers International, Central Illinois, and Springfield African American Museum at the table. We looked at the criteria for bringing the quote-unquote lynching monument to Springfield, especially the community education and participation piece, and thought 1908 Race Riot Commission had many years back brought that horrific white mob action to the attention of Springfield community. Additionally, the NAACP was pursuing establishing a national monument in Springfield. We looked at the application, and quite quickly, Catherine, Devin, and Jim offered to draft it. We were on our way, the fast track, or so we thought. By the second meeting in February, Cinnamon, who you just heard speak, and Shannon, who will take over from me, joined our group. Great additions. Cinnamon brought with her knowledge of how to tell history, how other communities were pursuing the monuments, and Shannon had introduced herself to me and taught me the importance of painful truth-telling as part of healing conversations. At that point, the discussion focused on how and when we would bring in the greater Springfield community. By the way, joining was just attending the meeting. There are no membership criteria. We met again at the beginning of March to review the application, what we wrote, and to start planning how we were going to go public and invite the Chicago group. At that time, we learned that EJI had been inundated with inquiries, pulled back the initial application, and we were on hold. Days later, the state shut down due to the pandemic. Months later, the horrific murder of George Floyd, a reminder that violence against Blacks and the terror it brings continues and must be confronted today honestly. Yet, during that time, we were on hold waiting for the all clear to meet again in person. When it became obvious that it would be a long, long time, we had to determine whether we could or should reconvene on Zoom, and finally we did in January 2021. By then, EJIs released their new criteria, which so poignantly and passionately reflects the so much needed and so long overdue truth-telling dialogue. And now it's my pleasure to have Shannon talk with you about where we are today and to thank our growing coalition of partners, and we hope individuals, and we invite individuals. Shannon?
Thank you, Nancy. Greetings, everyone. If we can progress the slide, thank you. So I'm going to tell you about Springfield Equal Justice Initiative Project, the collective, and where we're at today and where we hope to be going forward. So we put on the screen, which you can also find at our website, which is Springfield Equal Justice Project, is our vision and our purpose. And we recognize that, you know, we're in our infancy and that, like all good things, we are a living, you know, group, and our vision and purpose are also living statements. So we understand that there may be needs to adjust and better reflect our vision and purpose. For now, we agree to go as follows: that we envision Springfield as a model city for creating space for authentic remembrance of our community history, and for residents to exercise their agency and participate in equal justice initiatives. And that vision statement is important for a number of reasons. And I think two key things to note in it is model city. Yes, we are assuming bragging rights for Abraham Lincoln. We believe that we should be a model city of what a better angels design city is, an inclusive city that continues to adjust and rise and bring itself, all citizens together to exemplify the best in each and all of us. So model city is important. And then the second part that's as important is to give residents, people, all citizens, their due agency and space to participate. You can never plan for people. You have to plan with people. And if a community can plan together, then that creates the best opportunity for sustainability. And we know this from practice. And we agreed upon, for now, our purpose. The purpose of SEJP is to engage the Springfield community in public acknowledgements and remembrances of our past racial injustices, and an ongoing engagement to confront current injustices within our community. And that indeed, of course, speaks in line with, as you heard from Cinnamon and from Nancy, the goal and the purpose of all of this, according to Equal Justice Initiative, the national. Indeed, it also fits to the work that so many have been doing for so long in other ways, under other names, and continue to do collectively and even individually, to make sure that we are always working to uncover the true and authentic stories that shape our collective we in our community. And that in order to understand what we need to do today, we have to have truth telling regarding our past. So we can't rest on what we know. You know, the old saying, you know better, you do better. And so that lends to current injustices within our community, because we must continue to work toward justice. It's that, you know, goal that we all continue to work for, I should hope. Next slide, please. So in line with EJI, and as you heard even from the example from Cinnamon, we have, at least for now, organized under into committees under these three areas. And we're hoping that as people join along in this effort, that they will recognize that this is all hands on deck. This is action in, you know, beautiful community collective action in motion. So there are no bystanders necessarily in this, and that we hope that everyone who comes aboard is engaged. So they are either hopefully going to be engaged on more than one of the three committees. The first one being community assessment. And this is to be able to set, these are the temporary goals set, but to set our goals around the idea of a comprehensive remembrance over the past 10 years. That's not necessarily fixed, but it's something that is articulated in EJI. Write an authentic and accurate narrative of our past racial injustice in order to tell the true story, and so we all can learn and heal. Document current racial and social economic injustices. Under the category of educate, that committee has community education goals that will utilize social media, community contact virtually and otherwise, should we be able to, but in all kinds of forms. Certainly leaning into the arts and culture. We know that's a beautiful way to heal at every opportunity. So from visuals to, you know, orals to dance to what have you, what the community works and the committee works to decide. Those kinds of ways are how the tools that we'll use to educate people about what we have found out through our assessment process, and that will also go on our community calendar, as will other social justice related events that of organizations that are part of SEJP. So that's one of the other benefits of all of us working collectively. We have a community calendar of social justice, and that's pretty rare. And then outreach. We want to constantly outreach. This cannot be done, once again, and EJI makes it really clear, without the community. This is a grassroots community collective project. And as part of that, we come together and we bring people with us, and we have those very courageous, vulnerable, difficult conversations around race and social identity. And we have those dialogues so that we can reach a higher understanding of who we are as a community. Next slide, please. So we thought it would be helpful to just sort of capture in Brian Stevenson's words. Brian Stevenson, of course, is a reminder, the founder, the attorney, referred to by some now as the Nelson Mandela of our times. I believe Oprah calls him the super soul of our nation. But Brian Stevenson has just simply given us a way to always keep in mind why we're doing what we're doing. And this always connects back to our story of who we are as a country, as people, as citizens of the United States. So why do we collect the soil? I'm going to read this aloud, but please read along with me, because I think the words are really powerful. In this soil, there is the sweat of the enslaved. In the soil, there is the blood of victims of racial violence and lynching. There are tears in the soil from all those who have labored under the indignation and humiliation of segregation. But in the soil, there is also the opportunity for new life, a chance to grow something hopeful and healing for the future. So that's why the soil collection of where the lynchings happened is so critical. That's the one real tangible connection that we can have, if you will, to our past, to the part of our story that is so critical for us to understanding who we are as a community. And that also means that we have to reckon with and understand and unpack the narratives that we have as a community, the stories that we tell about our history and our community, and dissect them, peel them back to ensure that they are holistic, that they offer the viewpoints of all of our citizens, because that's the collective we. And that's our collective story, the good, the bad, the ugly. It is, but it's our story as our community. And those are oftentimes demonstrated, of course, by sculptures and public artwork, and even viewings in what we see in museums and art halls. And public art is so important. So the public narrative a nation creates, Stevenson says, about what is important is reflected in memorials and monuments. Who is honored? What is remembered? What is memorialized? Tell a story about a society that can't be reflected in other ways. And I think we all can agree on that. We are a product of our environment, and if we don't see us, it really takes away from a sense of who we are. And if we see something false, then we begin to believe that it's true, and that narrative is exceptionally damaging and only seeks to keep us divided. And so then the next slide, if you will, this is really important, because this really kind of goes to the committee and engagement and dialogue. And dialogues, transformational dialogues in our community are really important. And many of you are very familiar with all the concepts or tenets of it. But the change to it, if you will, is that it borrows from so many to ensure that we have a balance of power of all the voices within our community at the table when we just have those difficult conversations of at least two different identities as we discuss the history of race and social injustice in our community. And Brian Stevenson says, we must truthfully confront our history of racial injustice before we can repair its painful legacy. It is only when we tell the truth that we have a consciousness that allows us to repair the damage, to restore confidence, and to build healthy relationships. And at the end of the day, isn't that what we all want? So we hope that you all will engage with us here in Springfield. If you are elsewhere or have identified that you're elsewhere, we hope that you are engaged in that. There is a poll, if you will take it real quick. I think Devin's going to throw it up for me. And we just kind of want to capture what's your engagement in social justice, or is it not? And that's okay too. We recognize that everybody comes here with baggage, biases, their own understandings, and processing all that we've gone through as a nation and continue to go through on a daily basis in many unfortunate ways and painful and traumatic ways. So we're all in different spaces right now, and that's okay. As we seek to join together, we hope we do it in a manner that allows us to unpack who we are as individuals so that we can see and respect the divine that is in others, so that collectively we create a strong, healthy, inclusive we, and that becomes the narrative of the model city of Springfield and hopefully your own town. Thank you very much. We will take questions. There is a key link on the call to action screen that's up, and that is the second one. That's the monument interest form. Whether you're here in Springfield and Sangamon County or somewhere else, that is the form that everyone fills out, and EJIs ensures that you are connected with the county if there's any activity and they have notice of other people in your county who are also engaged. And our website, and if you are interested in us speaking to your group or you want to know more, please use our email address on the screen and contact us. And please take a moment to do the poll. Thank you so much.
Okay, I know we've had several questions come through the Q&A and through the chat, so the panelists can all see those. And did you want to respond to those directly, or if anyone had questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat now or raise your hand, or I'm not sure if we are if people can speak up and do so, but you can see there's a couple that have come through on the Q&A. So if you wanted to address those, however you'd like to do it.
Sure. I can just read a couple and then maybe hand it off to others. How's that sound? Just looking at the Q&A in particular, I'll just do those two, and then I'll ask Nancy and Shannon to check out what's on the chat maybe. So the first question, actually both questions are from the same gentleman, Tim, asking about whether the EJI Memorial exists a part of the site of the 1908 Springfield race riot, or if one is planned for here. Great clarifying question. And so what we do have in town is a wonderful series of markers across the city that show us where these events took place, and that work was done many, many years ago by a community organization of people successfully. And so we're not talking about replacing those or doing something to change those. The markers in particular are those that are prescribed by EJI that are historical markers like you traditionally see, but then there's also a marker process related to the Peace and Justice site, that the idea being that you bring these markers home to mark the places in which these harms were created. So yes, it's planned for sure. Timeline unknown. It depends upon our community and how we work together to learn and share and create change. And the second one, I'll ask this to my colleagues as well. Have you heard if there were even some non-residents of Springfield that were part of the white mob during the 1908 riots? I'm trying to think about my readings. I don't know if Shannon or Nancy, you've got a response to that, if folks outside of Springfield joined in. I don't think I read that they did. Springfield had its own mob situation. There were plenty of people who were murderous. I don't know, Shannon or Nancy, have you heard anything outside of Springfield, folks joining in?
No, I have not. That said, I recognize that as part of today's webinar, we not only have Devin, who may know that answer, but we also have Catherine Harris, who may know that answer. So I encourage them to respond to that if they are able to. And that you can always put that in the chat. I don't know that that's something that we know. We do have a question from the chat regarding asking, how do you plan to compile the timeline? i.e., what are the sources that can be used? That's a great question. It's a premature question, fortunately, because we're just in our infancy. We just labeled the committees. And right now we're focused on getting more people engaged and involved. And that committee, which I believe I can say that Devin is going to be leading, with Cinnamon leading the education, and I will be leading the outreach and dialogues. So I think Devin, along with everyone else who's on that committee, will figure that out. We recognize that learning and unpacking who we are in any community requires us to dig into sources that traditionally are not used. So that means we have to look at the Black newspapers, the Black church records, and et cetera. And we can't rely upon our traditional, more popular media sources or even writings to give us that understanding, but we can find out. Devin says, oh, everybody can see that. There's good evidence that some came from surrounding towns, or at least some people who worked in Springfield but lived in nearby towns participated. The latter of that certainly sounds like it could be true.
And just a similar situation and throughout this whole thing with taking my notes, and I was taking quite a few of them, there's lots of parallels between this and East St. Louis in 1917. And I know from the original round of indictments, from which there were exactly 0 convictions, most of the people were white East St. Louisans. Most of them were. And of course, the one person who was convicted was Dr. Leroy Bundy, a Black dentist in the community who actually had nothing to do with starting the riots. And he was later, he was imprisoned, and then he was later exonerated and released. And unsurprisingly left Illinois, moved to Cleveland, and never came back. But yeah, that was part of our research for the 2017 commemorations that we did, which actually what we, the group that got together and did them, which involved our historical society, it was telling who was involved and who was engaged with this and who wasn't. And it was a real sobering experience. How many people either didn't know about this seminal point in our local history that this happened here and its wider implications, but those who knew about it but didn't want to remember it, just didn't either just this is conscious forgetting. And if we are to tell the full story, if we are to stay true to that, these are the stories that we must confront and understand, because it can't be swept under the rug. It was so influential, and it was, and that's why, I was taking a lot of notes here, because what you have started to do in Springfield will serve as a great model, especially for a community like ours, who has this in its past, but who always hasn't always owned up to it, or even admitted that it happened, or how important that it was. And we all understand how difficult those conversations are going to be. I mean, these are the great grandchildren who are alive today of the people who did this. So, it's coming to terms with that. But I was just was less of a comment, less of a question, more of a comment. But I just saw lots of parallels here.
Indeed. And I think the commemorations that you all do there, I know Father Brown speaks of it often, and the acknowledgement and even the Edwardsville work that they're doing with their new provost, the young sister that's there, is just remarkable, and acknowledging those stories and acknowledging and sharing the truth. And, you know, sometimes we have to lean in, as we have all heard, to what is most difficult, to the big problem. And I think that when we do that with an understanding, as I hope we demonstrated here, and certainly Cinnamon opens with a trauma-aware way, we know that trauma is carried in all of us. So when we have these dialogues about our painful past of slavery, lynching, terror mobs, Jim Crow, and and how they inform the incidents that are happening today, we know it's going to be traumatizing for all of us, and different degrees for all. And so we have to do it in a way that allows us to give space and grace to ourselves for feeling it, yay, humanity, but also to one another. But it's the only way when we touch the divine within one another, and that we find in the truth. You know, that's the foundation of justice. When we speak that truth, can we heal and create a new, powerful, true, authentic, shared story? So there's all kinds of great work going around. If I can add one more thing, just for things checking out. So one of the ways, you know, because a lot of this is getting people who traditionally are researching one way or another, whether they're professionals or otherwise, to begin recognizing you have to look elsewhere. That which had been deemed by academia not worthy. And now we recognize that, of course, that wasn't true. These are very critical stories that are important to inform us. And so now we have to look in non-traditional places. And in doing that, I think I'm always heartened when I hear all these different stories, but one in particular is that I believe the newspaper is Kansas Star. It's out of Kansas. And they went back, you guys may have heard this story on NPR, and they went back and they looked at their coverage in the newspaper, and I forget what period of times, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and they looked at their coverage of the city and particularly of Black people and Black families, and realized not only how scant, but how biased it was. And they recognized that oftentimes the stories were so incomplete, but had now become fact, that indeed it was burdening people today, from people being able to get Googled and their name comes up. The idea being that sometimes we have to go back and unpack what we have, you know, marketed and pimped out in our society as fact, and say it wasn't factual, but that's okay. We are learning to do better, and we're going to do better together. But we have to recognize that.
At that, 1 o'clock on the nose. We did have one last question that I answered in the chat about what's happening at the site. And Devin's sharing what's coming next with this great symposium. Thank you, Illinois State Historical Society.
And thank you to our panelists for a fascinating discussion. And it starts here. This is a step along a path. And thank you so much for sharing your excellent, relevant historical work with all of us today. We really appreciate it.
Two last words, please join.
Yes, please do.
Because this is the beginning, and every question that you've asked will be answered as we progress. I learn more every day. Please join us.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us today.
All right.